When people talk about tipping, it's usually in absolutes. You either love it or you hate it. What was once a gesture of appreciation and incentive for good service now has become the norm. Coffee from Starbucks, want a tip? Burger from McDonald's, want a tip? Order from a self-checkout machine, want a tip? Tip, 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 tip. And people are getting fed up. 66% of Americans now view tipping negatively. So I want to dig deeper into the tipping system and how it's actually really harmful for both service workers and customers. But first, we need to understand how tipping culture started. For most of US history, tipping for better service was seen as un-American and a form of class bribery. The thought was, if you tip somebody, you view that person as socioeconomically inferior. But everything changed after the Civil War. In the 1860s, after the Emancipation Proclamation, millions of newly free men and women looked for work. Seeing an opportunity, many restaurants hired them, paid them $0, and forced them to rely on voluntary tips from customers. Over time, tipping spread throughout the country. Tipping was originally a way for businesses to exploit workers by getting away with paying little or no wages at all, at least for a little while longer. In 1938, the first federal minimum wage law was established, making 25 cents an hour the lowest someone can be paid, except for hotel, restaurant, and tip service workers. It wasn't until 1996 when tipped workers were finally included. Sort of. In 1996, the new federal minimum wage was $4.75 an hour, and instead of including tipped workers in this law, the government just created a separate tipped minimum wage law of $2.13 an hour just for tipped workers. But it did require restaurant owners to ensure their tipped workers earned at least the standard minimum wage of $4.75 per hour. Basically, if tips fell short, the restaurant owner had to cover the difference to meet the standard minimum wage. So if a tipped worker worked for 2 hours and only made $8 including tip, the restaurant owner would have to give them an extra $1.50 so they would meet the standard minimum wage laws. The problem is, 84% of restaurant owners don't do this. Nowadays, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, and the tipped minimum wage is still $2.13 an hour. Over the past years, tips have become a de facto service charge on top of your bills. Out went the tip jars at a counter, and in came the digital touchscreens with predetermined tipped options, 18, 25, 45%, or if you're really lucky, some places will tack on a mandatory 20% tip on top of your bill, just to save you some brain power and time. How nice of them. Discussions around tipping can be difficult to navigate. It's always filled with fighting words, typos, and angry caps lock. While there's no shortage of strong opinions, it is difficult to discern what's quote-unquote right. And the truth is, there's good points on both sides. But let's get one thing straight. Currently, tips are necessary for restaurant service workers to make ends meet, so don't just outright stop tipping. The problem most people don't realize is the tipping system actually hurts the very same people who rely on it. First, a common point I see is the tipping system gives people like waiters and bartenders the opportunity to earn way more, on average, than people with similar skill levels. A great waiter can make $800 in 5 days with tips, but a minimum wage worker can only make $290 in the same time period. The reality is there simply aren't a lot of jobs available that would pay above minimum wage for people without degrees, certifications, or who can only work limited hours a week. Moving tip service workers to a fixed livable wage model would on average lead to pay cuts. The problem is, that's the average. Not every waiter can work in a fancy restaurant in Manhattan or be able to work weekend night shifts when customers tend to tip the most. If you don't get those shifts, you're gonna make a lot less money. The amount a waiter makes on any given day can swing wildly depending on the day of the week or the season. In January, they might be able to afford a new phone. In March, they're eating boxed ramen to get by. The poverty rate among tip servers is nearly double that of other workers. The result? Tipped employees are 3 times more likely to be on food stamps. Oftentimes, some of the biggest proponents of the tipping system are the servers who earn the most. But it's the waiters who aren't earning much that might prefer the security of a consistent, predictable paycheck that comes with a livable hourly wage. And if you want to escape the rat race and build a wealthier and healthier life, sign up for my free weekly newsletter, Rethinkable, link below. When it comes to how much a tip service worker can make, it's subject to the whims of their customers. Whether it's sunny or rainy outside, if they're having a good or bad hair day, or if they're a downright bigot or not. Economist Ian Ayres and his colleagues know a thing or two about this topic. They collected tipping data on over 1,000 taxi cab rides in New Haven, Connecticut. Then they identified the factors that led to bigger tips. And the result? White cab drivers received bigger tips than Black, Hispanic, and Asian cab drivers. This finding, along with many other studies to back it, have come to the conclusion that tipping is kind of discriminatory. Studies have found that blonde women wearing red received bigger tips, and attractive servers have been shown to earn over $1,000 more in tips per year than unattractive ones. When it comes to these types of customers, many of them know their tips are the service worker's main source of income, and they take advantage of this fact. They feel more emboldened to be verbally and physically inappropriate. That's why the restaurant industry has a significantly higher rate of sexual harassment than any other industry in the US. Although only 7% of women in the workforce are in the restaurant industry, they account for 37% of sexual harassment complaints. When waiters complain to their manager about this, they might just tell them to brush it off because they don't want to lose a customer. So waiters are forced to just accept it and hope for the best. But tipping doesn't just harm service workers, it also harms the customers. Traditionally, customers left a tip to say thank you for exceptional service. Naturally, servers felt incentivized to give better service. The logic was sound. In economics, they call this the equity theory. Basically, people tend to feel anxious when a relationship with someone else isn't equitable. If you're networking with another person and you feel like you're benefiting significantly more from the conversation, you'll naturally want to return the favor sooner or later. When it comes to dining, if the customer sees a server going above and beyond, they'll tend to return the favor with a bigger tip. The problem is, this isn't actually true. Consider one study that shows a very weak link between tip and server performance. Nowadays, the most important factor for customers deciding how much to tip is the amount of the check, not how great or terrible the service was. If you eat at a restaurant on Monday and a server brings you a very nice $5,000 bottle of wine, and on Friday you go to the same exact restaurant with the same exact server, but this time he only brings you a $100 bottle. Even if the service was equally exceptional, the tips would vary widely because you would tip based on the cost of the bill. The difference in a 20% tip would be $980, a $1,000 tip versus a $20 tip. Tips are no longer voluntary demonstrations of appreciation, but rather a requirement. Servers know all about this, and they use it to encourage you to order more expensive things on the menu. They know they can give you amazing service and still get tipped pennies. And they know they can give horrible service and still get a great tip. When it comes to inflation, nothing is safe, not even tips. Tipflation has been a phenomenon since the beginning of the service industry. In the 1950s, most people tipped 10% of the bill. By the 1970s, 15%. Now in 2023, most people tip 21%. Even for the strongest proponents of tipping, it's becoming more financially challenging to do. For most Americans, eating out is a way to celebrate and relax after an exhausting workday. You just got out of work, you don't have the energy to make food, so you go out to eat. You typically tip 20%, but sometimes you might not be able to. Maybe your paycheck was late or today's service was abysmal. But you still feel an intense and unhealthy psychological pressure to tip because you don't want to violate this social norm. This struggle becomes especially challenging as the wealth gap widens. In economics, they call this negative externality imposed by the wealthy. Basically, when people who have money can afford to tip a lot, they negatively impact the rest of society. When rich people can financially spend more money and tip more, they raise the tipping expectations for everyone. As a result, those who earn less, like the middle and lower class Americans, feel the unhealthy psychological pressure to keep up with the wealthy. And this only gets worse when people on the internet shout in all caps, "If you can't afford to tip 21%, you shouldn't go out to eat." The problem is, if everyone avoided eating out because they couldn't afford to tip the full 21% every time, restaurants would go out of business and millions of servers would lose their jobs. In economics, they call this economies of scale. Basically, when a business can produce more things, the cost to produce an additional thing becomes cheaper. When it comes to restaurants, they all have fixed costs to pay, like rent, equipment, and insurance. Restaurant owners will have to pay these costs every month, whether they serve 10 or 500 customers. This means restaurants need as many customers as possible, including the low and non-tippers, to reduce their overall cost, maintain a profit, and continue employing their servers. Alright, so if the tipping system harms both service workers and customers, why do we still have it? After some research, I discovered this can be explained by game theory. Basically, game theory shows how outcomes come to be when multiple people are involved and are driven by their own interest. In this case, the self-interest of servers, customers, and restaurant owners. When it comes to the server's interest, just like how some people vote against increasing taxes on the wealthy in hopes that they'll become billionaires one day, servers might want to keep the tip system in hopes that they'll eventually be able to earn what those at the top earn. And while many servers may prefer a consistent livable wage in the long run, many might feel they deserve to earn more if they work during peak hours when the kitchen looks like the trading floor of a stock exchange in the 70s. If they were on a livable hourly wage, they would earn the same, regardless if they worked on a Monday at 2 p.m. or a Friday at 7 p.m. Next, the customer's interest. Naturally, if tipping is removed, restaurant owners will have to increase their menu prices to absorb the additional labor cost. Even though 66% of Americans aren't a fan of tipping, only 16% are willing to pay higher prices. Consider a 2010 study that found when people were prompted to pick between voluntary tipping or a 15% mandatory service charge, which by the way was actually lower than the average tip percentage that people gave, people preferred tipping 4 times more. 4 times. Tipping made customers feel better about the additional cost because, in their head, a tip was an act of charity. Even though both the voluntary tip and mandatory service charge, they were going to be distributed to the servers anyway. When it comes to the restaurant's interest, Danny Myers, founder of Union Square Hospitality Group, or better known as the guy who started Shake Shack, wanted to pay servers a stable wage. So he ran an experiment in his restaurants. In 2015, he eliminated tipping, added a service charge, and increased server wages from $5 to $9 an hour. This announcement went viral online. Customers flocked to his restaurants and job applications soared. But in 2020, Danny reversed course and reinstated tipping at all his restaurants because of the uncertain future of the industry, and he saw a significant drop in revenue during lockdowns. The problem is, if a restaurant mogul like Danny couldn't make this financially feasible, it would be nearly impossible for smaller restaurant owners without a larger, grander initiative across the board. But what if I told you that the tipping system and tipflation should be the least of your worries? What most people don't realize is that when it comes to finances, you are playing a rigged system, and you are literally being programmed to stay poor. Click here to learn why and how you can reprogram your mind to finally stop.